So our first question tonight is, what exactly does the Bible explain will still happen in the future as opposed to what has already happened? The second coming of Jesus is still future. In 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about the Lord's coming. And that's actually the resurrection chapter. And he begins in chapter 15. In fact, if you take notes in your Bible, if you put notes in your Bible, I'd put down beside chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians, the resurrection chapter. And it talks about it in the first few verses, how that Jesus was buried, he rose again on the third day, and he was seen of Cephas, which is Peter, then the 12 disciples, and then above 500 other people at once. And Paul said by the time he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, most people were still alive that were witnesses. But anyway, he begins to talk about the resurrection. And some people believed that there was no resurrection, and Paul went on to explain, there definitely is. If there's no resurrection, and if Jesus didn't rise, we're lost. But anyway, the resurrection is still going to occur, and that is said to occur at the coming of the Lord. And that's in 1 Corinthians 15 and 23, they that are Christ's at his coming. Now this coming is not the AD 70 coming, because there was no resurrection like 1 Corinthians 15 describes in AD 70. There wouldn't have been a church if people were resurrected in AD 70. So the moment, the twinkling of an eye, the last trumpet, when that sounds, that's still future. But Armageddon, that Revelation talks about, that was the battle against Israel in AD 70. And like I said, that's in Revelation, and the book of Revelation said these things would shortly come to pass and they were at hand. And it says that in chapter 1, and it says it in the end of the book in chapter 22. And he said, don't seal the words of this prophecy because the time is at hand. And then that resurrection involves what some people call the rapture, which means the catching up of our bodies into the air, and that's in 1 Thessalonians 4. So that's all, but that's basically it. That is really all that's going to come. And the white throne judgment in Revelation 20 is where we're going to be resurrected to. We're going to go immediately to judgment when we're resurrected, when our bodies are changed. There's not going to be any tribulation after the rapture, after the coming of the Lord. Everybody is going to be judged. Even the dead, the sinners, the unbelievers. There's actually a resurrection of damnation that the Bible talks about. And in John chapter 5, it talks about these resurrections. Somewhere around verse 26. 28. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So everybody is going to resurrect at that point. Everybody, even sinners. And you hear the idea that the church is going to be raptured or resurrected, and the sinners are going to be left behind. No. When Jesus comes, the second coming, the church, we're going to change in body in the moment of a twinkling of an eye. We're going to rise in the air. We're going to be with Jesus. But the sinners are going to resurrect also, but it's going to be called the resurrection of damnation. And again, mark this down or look at it in your Bible. It's John 5, 28 to 29. There's a resurrection of life and the resurrection of damnation. And everyone in the grave shall hear his voice. And the book of Acts actually talks about that too. A resurrection of the just and of the unjust. And I can't think of the chapter right now where that is found. But so the second coming is going to occur. There's going to be no signs of the second coming. All of the signs that people talk about, that they say, oh, the Lord's coming, there's a sign of the times, they were signs in the first century. Jesus said to those people standing there, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. You shall see earthquakes and all of this. And all earthquakes and wars and all these things, they're not signs of the second coming. They were signs in the first century of the destruction against Jerusalem that was going to come. But so from this point on, the resurrection is going to occur. We don't know when it's going to occur. There's only one kind of indication that we can get. And let me show you that. It's in Revelation 20. And Revelation 20, it talks about the church ruling and reigning with Jesus. And of course, we're kings and priests now. We're seated with him on the throne. We're ruling and reigning with him. But in Revelation 20, it says in verse 7, the 1,000 years it's talking about is a symbolic number describing the church age. It's the whole time of the church, including now. When the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. Excuse me. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That's about the only sign we're going to get, is the devil is going to gather nations against the beloved city, which is the church. Hebrews 12 and 22 calls the church the heavenly Jerusalem. And so when all the nations come against the church, all the nations, that is a sign that the Lord's coming. And that's in Revelation 20, verses 7, 8, and 9. And God's going to cause fire to come down out of heaven and destroy them. And the devil's going to be cast into the lake of fire at that point. Excuse me. And we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, or the white throne judgment, in Revelation 20 and verse 11. And so, in other words, there's going to be this war against the church by the whole world. And God is going to judge them. Fire is going to come out of the heavens. And we're going to the white throne judgment when the resurrection occurs. The resurrection will occur right after this. Excuse me. The resurrection will take us to this white throne judgment after God's wrath falls upon the nations, all the nations of the world, not just some of them. See, there's never been a time when all nations were against the church, but that is going to happen. Excuse me, I got a bug in my throat tonight. And so, that's pretty well it. There's no millennium after the resurrection. What people call the millennium, or the 1,000 years in Revelation 20, like a time after Jesus comes, when Jesus is on earth and Israel's here, that is referring to the church age. And so then you ask, that sign definitely will happen, or could? That has to happen before the second coming? Yes. It definitely is going to happen. It's not that it could. Revelation 20 said that it will happen. Satan will be loosed. See, right now Satan is bound. And then when he's loosed, he's going to gather all the world against the church. And that's the beloved city in Revelation 20. And then the resurrection is going to occur after that at the Lord's coming. And we're going to the white throne judgment.